I'm gonna be straight with you guys right now. I have no clue where this Batman is from, but he looks cool. He looks cool. I have no context as far as why he's wearing a giant suit. I have never read the Justice League in the Sixth Dimension comic. I don't know. I don't know any of the context or backstory as to why it is that Batman is sporting a giant mech suit. Very different from the other one that I've already covered on the channel that was also a mega figure. This is incredibly different looking. This is much more dynamic, much more slimmed down, a little bit more on the organic side. And I still, frankly, don't care. I felt compelled to pick it up because it looks cool, as Todd likes to say. It looks really cool, and I'm gonna make a figure out of it. And I can't necessarily blame him. If anything, that was probably the whole background as to how McFarlane came to make this mega figure. He probably saw it on a panel. Somebody recommended the artwork that you blatantly see from behind the box on the mega figure DC Multiverse box, and he probably saw that panel someplace, or somebody, like I said, shot him a DM with it, and he thought, that's cool, let's make it a figure. And now here we are. Finally, after the leaks of seeing the final suit kind of labeled within the documents and some preemptive stuff, we finally have our proper look at the DC Multiverse mega figure final suit Batman from Sixth Dimension Justice League, or whatever that comic arc is necessarily called. And you can see that it's a little bit different than the prior mech that Batman has utilized. This time he's going for a much more, like I said, organic, almost alien looking, very interdimensional bat suit, final suit, mega suit, whatever you want to call it. And frankly, I think this one is doing it for me a little bit better than the straightforward gray one. Granted, I do like the rivets and the machinations that look very textural to the suit from that prior version, but there's something about the color scheme with this version that is just so complementary and clashes well together. Primarily the eggshell white that is a little on the glossy side when it comes to the plastic that it's encompassing, to then the orange copper. I don't necessarily want to straight up say copper, but it's almost like a very golden orange copper, and it's not even matted. I don't want to say that this texture is matted. It's more like a semi glossy finish, semi, robust. I don't know. There's a specific term for it. But as far as these little accents for the orange copper kind of look to the parts here on the thighs, the majority of the arms, and then of course adorning the bat symbol here at the front, all of these colors, with of course a good splash of black in between the panels and between the rivets and such, are just really doing it for me. That really sells the figure. The only other color that you can kind of see splash about right here that's different from those would have to be a little bit of that teal blue utilized for the visor there on the center. But it's offset by the little bit of white right there to kind of make it look like it's a visor. And so all of these colors, I don't know what it is, but they're very pleasant to the eye. It's what really stood out to me when they first revealed it back at Toy Fair and made me go, I'm sorry, but I kept pausing on those little pass-throughs when they were covering Toy Fair and kept looking at this guy and going, I need to pick him up. And then once you get past the color, you see the intricacies of the sculpting as far as the paneling, the little, like I said, very alien design to the way that some of these white panels are etched in, a little bit of the lining here, the sculpting. It really does work for me. It does look pretty, like I said, slimmed down. You generally expect something very robust and very bulky when it comes to Batman, but this time around he went with something a little bit more on the slim side. But again, it kind of favors this take on the character, as far as, in my opinion, one of the favorite parts right here would have to be this overall chest piece, where you see, like I said, all the panels kind of coming together, the rivets, but then feeding into a much more alien design that doesn't look very earthly. So not much more that I can really comment on, except to say that it just works and complements the look of the character. That then leads us to these very spiky areas right about right here, specifically around the shoulder guards, which are made out of this like rubberized plastic, but overall, it just looks very, very, again, cool. It's the essence of cool. And I do appreciate that they are glued onto the biceps so that it doesn't do anything to interfere with the articulation that's happening on the top shoulders. But we'll get to that momentarily. And again, so many of the little details as far as like the little circles, the ovals, the very alien aesthetic, it just really does work for me. And speaking of, again, little portions here and there that do look very complementary to the figure, this little design right here around the head sculpt that you can see it, like I said, some of the machinery happening within the black part right here from inside the collar, this part that's a little bit on the lifted side. And that leads us to the actual head sculpt in and of itself, which to me, I think is really sculpted pretty well up until you get to the ears. The ears, they're not bad. They're sculpted and they look pretty pleasing and they fit the figure and they fit the design, but they're made out of this rubberized piece that's very easy to warp. And while we're on the subject of warping, you do have these, again, pieces of the shoulder guard that I was complimenting a little bit earlier, but they're even a little bit more on the flimsy side. They do feel like they could potentially prove problematic as time goes on when it comes to like warping and wear and tear over time. And then that gets even worse with this cod piece that, again, kind of feeds to this alien kind of very ancient sort of design to the mech suit that I do like from a design standpoint, but the execution could have been done a little bit better because you can see kind of how flimsy the rubber really is with this piece. I understand that they had to make it quote-unquote family safe, but I do wish that this was probably a bit more... Okay, I just realized what I was doing. I should probably cut this part out. Or I could just leave it in for the comments. I don't know. Who knows? But speaking of suggestive motions, let's take it to the back, shall we? Because here, again, we get a closer look at some of the cool things that I do enjoy about the figure, which is, again, the very cool look of the panels kind of fusing together here at the back of the legs. That then leads us to the black parts that kind of connect everything together. This part right here looks a little rubberized and hydraulic looking, but I know that's not. So that's, again, a very cool illusion to the molded plastic. Leading us to this back piece right here, which may or may not look a little bit familiar. That's because if you then take them and open them up, you'll notice that you are dealing with wings. And from the get-go, you can see that they look pretty decent, sculpted, very thin plastic. I do like, again, feeding into the complementary colors. They're predominantly black, but they still carry on over that eggshell white here at the tips. But that's not really what I want to comment on. What I want to comment on is that they may or may not look a bit familiar. From the folding mechanism here on the inside to then the slight ratcheted articulation from the connection points here at the very top from within his back. And that's because, effectively, they reutilized the wings from the Hellbat DC Multiverse Batman figure. Yep. As soon as I pulled them out of the plastic, I'm like, oh, they're the same wings from the Hellbat models. So that's where I was like, okay, well, if they are, then that means that they should be removable, right? And you could tell right there that they are removable. Sometimes a bit to a fault because they're held together by these pegs that have just a slight, very subtle hexagonal shape. And it's so subtle that I feel like they should have gone for a much more chiseled design to the hexagonal pegging of this peg into the slots on his back because they are very, very prone to coming off. All right, you might as well just leave them alone because sure, they're almost designed to feel like they should be articulated so that you can kind of rotate them in place in this axis or fold them inwards and outwards. But every time I even want to manage these wings ever so slightly, they come off they're not loose, but they're just so prone to removing that there's times where I'm just like, screw these things. I'm just going to leave them off to the side, pull this one off, and just kind of have it be in a much more neutral pose and not be so top heavy with said wings. If anything, they probably should have accommodated with some better looking wings or just some better functioning wings other than to just take the Hellbat ones and just kind of apply them to here and just call it a day. Especially when they do kind of cover up a little bit more of the design happening here towards his back where you see an awful lot more of that paneling. But then one of my other favorite parts of this overall design is, like I said, a little bit of the part from within the shoulder here, but then leading to this piece right here that's a little bit on the sharper side that is made out of plastic that I wish that these shoulder pieces and the cod piece was made out of. You can kind of see right here, this top part right here, that feels very, very sturdy and made out of really good quality plastic and still retains that very cool alien design, that very Doom Eternal kind of aesthetic. So I do wish that they would have carried us on over, but I feel like once we got to these shoulder parts with the very enlarged spikes and the cod piece, some of those production costs probably came into play and they had to compromise. And I guess you could also make the argument that one of those compromises was also reutilizing these wings. So I guess you take some, you lose some, especially when it comes to the articulation, where you'll notice that some joints are a little bit on the sacrifice side, as with a good chunk of their mega figures, in favor of design and cool looking factor. So once you remove the wings, you are kind of given some further access to the articulation, which is why I wanted to tackle it right now once I got the wings removed, because once you get them out of the way, you then get much better flexibility, specifically around the arms. As I mentioned before, you do have these shoulder pieces that are then glued onto the bicep, allowing you a little bit better flexibility when it comes to rotation of the arms 360 in place. Just notice that because of the way that they're assembled to the body, they're almost a little bit at an incline, as you can kind of tell a little bit right there. It's subtle. It's not the most obvious kind of diagonal slash, but it is found there. I do notice it. However, you are able to extend off to the sides, and once you kind of flex a little bit of that shoulder guard piece, you are given just a little bit more clearance to go a little above the 180 degree, but it doesn't stay there. You'll notice right there that it kind of bounces back into place at the even 180. It can go farther, but the joint is a little bit on the ratcheted side, so you'll notice that it kind of just pops back into place right there, no matter how much you try to fight it. And then, this is difficult to explain, but you technically do have a bicep swivel, but you'll notice that after a while, the bicep swivel kind of loses quote unquote power, if that makes any sense. And as you kind of move the bicep kind of towards the outside, you'll notice that after a while, the bicep stops rotating and it's just the arm, the top arm joint, the ball joint, rotating towards the top right there. So I'm trying to flex, but then after a while, you then come into conflict with that shoulder guard piece. So there is a little bit of bicep swiveling, but it's not the most intuitive. It's not the most straightforward version of the joint. It's kind of, like I said, rotating a little bit at the bicep right there, but then the shoulder guard then impedes it right about right there. So there's a little bit of swiveling, but it's not going to be 360 like with some other McFarlanes. Again, we have to keep in mind that this is a mega figure. And much like with some other mega figures, you're not going to have two joints at the elbows. You're only going to have one, which is in this hinge design that then cuts across and only gives us about 90 degrees of flexing towards the top, as you can kind of see it right there. So a little bit of a good faith lost right there as far as the articulation. He looks cool, but I kind of wish we could bend the arm almost all the way up, and that is not achieved via right there. What you can achieve, however, is full wrist rotation right about right there with the ball joint, and decent flexing inwards and outwards of the wrist via the cut of the joint itself. But in return, we do get a pretty complementary torso articulation, much better than some other mega figures that we've gotten before, since we are dealing with a much more slimmed down mech suit than Batman has sported before. So in return, we get a much more articulated torso joint that is kind of designed with a dumbbell mechanism inside. I can't really tell, but you can see right here, I can kind of spoil it ahead of time. We got no waist articulation due to the way that this piece is designed, but from within the torso cut, you do get some rotation. It's funny because rotating to the left, it's a little bit stiff and it kind of comes into conflict with the way that the pieces are tooled. But when it comes to flexing towards the right, it does allow rotation. So you can technically rotate it 360, but you are dealt with a little bit of flexing of the plastic when you get to about that point right about right there. But it does allow it. You just kind of give it a little bit more of a firm press, and then crunching backwards and forwards, you can kind of see right there, the piece does allow a little bit of flexing in that motion, but about right there. And of course, side to side, due to the way that it's much more cut out from within right here. It's a little bit more hollowed out. So you are able to crunch on the obliques side to side right about right there. And it's difficult to explain, but what feeds into the notion that I think it's a dumbbell design is that you can see that the torso is kind of shifting from within. So it can kind of shift side to side without ever crunching. You can kind of see that happening right there. So it does feel like it's dumbbell right from within. So you kind of flex it in these kind of directions right here, which will at least feed into some cool poses later down the line. Or at the very least help us out with the top leg joints, which are a little bit complicated because you could see that similar to the top arms, they are cut out and designed in this very diagonal state, as you can actually much better see from the back right there with the very shrunken ass piece you got going on right there. But you can see the top leg joints right there. They are ball joints, but you have this kind of, like I said, diagonal cup design to the top legs. So when it comes to flexing forward, it's going to stop right about right there by default, just in a very vertical format. But when you start to kind of twist it off to the sides, you can go a little further. And that's only because of the way that those top leg sculpted pieces around it are designed. So you're just going to have to futz with it and compromise the motion with it. So that is a downside. I know that that's not exactly going to be favorable by many collectors or people who manage to come across this figure or to find out. And a similar thing could be said about the extension. However, here is a perfect segue to also lead us to the swivels that could be found on those ball joints, because technically speaking, we can swivel the leg at the top leg joint right about right there. You can kind of see a little bit of the motion happening as we rotate the leg at the bottom of that joint. In fact, theoretically, it can rotate 360 if you move the legs in the proper position. So by default like this, because like I said, the way that this diagonal piece is designed and cut down like this, you can't really rotate it when it's in a pose like this, in a very neutral pose as far as the legs are concerned. But once you move it off to the side, technically I can rotate that leg all the way around on that swivel, as you see before you right there. And therefore, when it comes to leg extension, going back to that premise, it only stops at about right there. But then when you rotate the legs, it does technically allow you to go further. So yeah, a little bit on the convoluted side when it comes to the top leg joints, but in order to favor this design, it looks like yet again another compromise they had to make. However, the rest of the Mega figure follows suit. There are 2 knee joints, yes, 2, as opposed to the elbow joint that only got 1. So you do get 2 cuts of the knees right about right there. That does allow the knee to fully bend all the way up like your traditional DC Multiverse figure. So I don't understand why we couldn't do that with the elbow, but I digress. You do have ball joints at the ankles. However, the pivoting upwards and downwards of the foot, because of the way that this overall robotic leg and ankle piece is designed, it's only able to pivot upwards and downwards almost like 1 notch on the riveted design of the ball joint in and of itself. However, you can fully rotate 360 at the top of the joint and technically still pivot inwards and outwards very laterally from the bottom of the joint. You don't even have to like incline it like that. I mean, you could do so, but if you just want to keep the foot facing forwards and just pivot inwards and outwards, it could be found there. So it does favor a little bit better balancing. I will just tell you right now, spoilers, this ankle joint, no matter how robust it feels, still doesn't help when it comes to adding the wings and creating a little bit of that top heaviness with the body. So you're still going to have to futz with an awful lot of not just the ankles, not just the elbows, but also the toes, which also don't bend as high up as I would have liked them. I do like the design, the feel of them, but I do think that the range of movement could have gone a little further than the toes. I feel like they stopped just a little bit too early for my taste, at least for a Mega figure of all things. But they could be found right about right there. I just do think that maybe if you're one of the customizers out there and kind of want to fidget and kind of mess with your figures and don't mind a little bit of elbow grease, maybe take like a Dremel so you can kind of flex the toes a little better and allow them for better clearance. And lastly, before I forget, because I went into a perfect segue and I did not want to ruin it, yes, the head is able to rotate 360. However, much like with some other Mega figures, it's got a neck design that is a little bit slanted. So even though it does allow full rotation on its axis for 360, bending or tilting downwards could practically not be found. It can kind of do it and nudges slightly down and nudges slightly up. But if you really want him to look all the way up, you're going to have to rely an awful lot on the torso articulation and even a little bit of the legs so that he can completely look all the way up and get some better vision. Because, yeah, it's designed with this kind of slant going downwards like some other Mega figures, not just Batman, but some other characters that just happen to have this kind of tooling to the design of the neck. And it's not, frankly, it's never been one of my favorites. So that's one of the things that I really wish that they could have fixed with this guy, because they were doing so well as far as a design standpoint. But I do wish that they could have kind of overhauled this a little bit, because sadly, the head articulation is probably one of the more limited ones. Tilting side to side also sometimes feels like it could be somewhat achieved, but it also feels like he's kind of turning by proxy, because every time I try to tilt the head, he ends up looking in that direction. I'm like, I want him to face forward, but just tilts. So David, effectively, you're just showing me a somewhat articulated statue. Why should I be compelled to pick this up? Well, it's roughly going a little cheaper than your average statue, especially since a lot of other figures from different companies have been affected by some recent price tags for obvious reasons. This guy has pretty much remained a little bit unchanged. Typically, Megafigures go for about 40 bucks, and that's practically what this guy's retailing for across different storefronts online. And on top of that, he just looks really cool. Again, it's a storyline that I'm not very familiar with. I don't know much of the context. And sure, it's kind of taking a little bit of what we've seen before as far as the wings, a little bit of the sacrifice on the articulation, but it at least kind of exposes us to a brand new look at the character, a different mech suit that Batman has utilized that's a bit more on the obscure side. It's not so obvious, but at the same time, it's something that I didn't know that I wanted, and McFarlane actually kind of gave the initiative to just go forward with a mega figure because it looked cool. It's something that maybe he could probably be eating up at a cost, but it at least sheds light on something that, you know, very unintentionally and very unlikely ended up working for certain collectors from a visual standpoint. I mean, we still have collectors that go for those Marvel statues that McFarlane is putting out. Most recently, the Venom one and the Iron Man are pretty frequently sought after by so many toy hunters. And I feel like a mega figure to this capacity should not be that much different, especially when it's going $10 cheaper than some of those 1/6 scale statues. And here you're dealing with a quality figure that sure sacrifices a little bit on the mobility, but as far as the paint apps complementing well with each other, the actual aesthetical look of the alien suit, and just kind of breaming some pretty neat badassery while at the same time still managing to give you yourself a little bit of that very neat display presence, I think it's a worthwhile pickup. I think it's actually one of the more unique Batmans that, sure, the most familiar pieces are the wings, but once you remove them, you're dealing with a mega figure that is, for the most part, a brand new original figure that I think I feel pretty happy of having in my collection. And therefore, I'm giving it a solid 8 out of 10 and a personal recommendation from me, but that's just my opinion. What do you guys think of the final suit from the Justice League 6th Dimension comics book story arc? Does it warrant a pickup for the 40 bucks, or do you think that mega figures are just taking up a little bit too much space and you rather just prioritize towards some other smaller scale figures? Or do you think that you're being a little bit tariffed out here and this is probably one of the sacrificial lambs so that you can then prioritize what you truly do want and need in your collection? I would gladly welcome the comments section down below with your guys' insights. And while you're down there, if you guys like this review, hit the thumbs up button. If not, however, hit the thumbs down. And as always, stay humble, take care, and I'll see you guys later.